I need a husband by tomorrow, I said, and the words tasted like panic and cheap wine, like something I could take back if I just swallowed hard enough, but I didn't because the music was too loud and my world was already falling apart in quieter ways that no one in that bar could see. The neon lights flickered over the counter, painting everything in shades of red and gold, and I remember thinking how strange it was that life could look so beautiful right before it broke you completely. Because that morning I had been given exactly 24 hours, not a minute more, to fix something that couldn't be fixed alone, not legally, not financially, not emotionally, and definitely not without a ring on my finger. I laughed after I said it, a brittle sound that didn't belong to me, lifting my glass like I had just told a joke instead of confessing a deadline that felt like a countdown to losing everything that mattered, and my friend across the table shook her head, telling me to stop being dramatic, but she didn't know, no one there knew, because desperation doesn't announce itself politely. It slips into your voice and turns impossible ideas into plans. I didn't notice him at first, not really, just another man in a dark suit sitting a few stools away, quiet in a way that didn't match the chaos around him, like the noise bent around him instead of touching him, like he existed in a different version of the room entirely. And if I had been thinking clearly, I might have wondered why no one bumped into him, why the bartender kept glancing his way without being called, why the air felt just a little heavier near that corner. But I wasn't thinking clearly, I was thinking about deadlines and signatures and the kind of paperwork that doesn't care how much you love someone, only whether you meet the conditions on time. Seriously, I added, leaning forward, lowering my voice like it made the situation more manageable. By tomorrow or it's over. And that was when it happened. Not the dramatic kind of moment you see in movies with music swelling and everything slowing down. Just a small shift, the quiet scrape of a chair. The subtle change in the room's rhythm, like something unseen had just decided to move, and suddenly he was there, standing closer than I expected, close enough that I could see the sharp line of his jaw, the calm in his expression, the kind of calm that didn't come from not caring but from being completely in control. I can solve that problem, he said, and his voice was low, steady, not loud but impossible to ignore, and I remember blinking at him, trying to decide if this was some kind of joke. Because normal people don't respond to desperate statements like that. Normal people laugh or look away or pretend they didn't hear. But he didn't do any of those things, he just watched me like he had already made a decision I hadn't even realized was being offered. "I'm sorry," I asked, my heart starting to beat a little faster, not from fear exactly, but from something I couldn't name yet, something that felt like standing too close to the edge of a story you didn't mean to step into. "You need a husband," he repeated, like it was a simple fact, like it was a problem with a clear solution, and then he tilted his head slightly, studying me in a way that made me feel seen and assessed at the same time. "I need a wife." And the way he said it wasn't romantic or playful, or even curious, it was final, like a contract already written, waiting for a signature, and somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the panic and the exhaustion and the ticking clock, something whispered that this was the moment everything changed, not because I asked for help, but because someone dangerous decided to answer. I stared at him for a second too long, waiting for the punchline that never came, because men like him did not make offers like that to women like me, not in real life, not without a hidden cost that I could not yet see, and something in the way he stood there, completely unhurried, completely certain, made the noise of the bar feel distant, like it had been turned down just for us. "That is not funny," I said, forcing a small laugh that sounded thinner than I intended. But he did not smile. Not even a little, his expression steady. Eyes locked on mine like he was measuring something invisible, something deeper than my words. "I am not joking," he replied, and there was no edge in his voice, no pressure, just a statement that settled into the space between us with quiet weight, and suddenly I became aware of everything I had not noticed before. The way people seemed to move around him without getting too close, the way the bartender kept glancing in our direction like he was waiting for a signal, the way the air felt just slightly different, heavier, like the room itself knew something I did not. "You do not even know me," I said, crossing my arms, trying to rebuild some kind of control, because this was ridiculous, it had to be, and yet my pulse was picking up anyway, reacting to something instinctive that I could not explain. "I know enough," he said, and then, as if that answer was sufficient, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed a small, clean card on the counter between us, sliding it toward me with 2 fingers, precise and deliberate, like every movement he made had been practiced until it became effortless. I looked down at it without touching it at first. My name was not on it, Nothing personal, just a name and a number, simple black lettering on white. But the name meant nothing to me, which somehow made it more unsettling because it should have meant something, it should have triggered recognition. But instead it felt like looking at the surface of something much larger hidden underneath. If you are serious, he continued. And now there was the faintest shift in his tone, not softer but more focused. Call that number within 1 hour. And I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, shaking my head slightly as I pushed the card back toward him, because this was not how solutions worked, this was how mistakes started. I do not marry strangers, I said, more firmly this time, holding his gaze, determined not to let whatever strange gravity surrounded him pull me in, because I had enough problems without adding a mysterious man in. A suit to the list. For a moment nothing changed, he just watched me, and then slowly he pushed the card back toward me again. Not forcing it, not insisting, just returning it to its place like the decision had always been mine to make. You asked for a solution, he said quietly, not comfort. And something about that hit harder than it should have because he was right, painfully right. I had not been looking for sympathy when I said those words. I had been looking for a way out, any way out, and now one was sitting in front of me, wrapped in something I did not understand. 1 hour, he repeated, then straightened, adjusting his jacket with a small, precise motion, and just like that, he stepped away, disappearing back into the dim edge of the room as if he had never been there at all, leaving behind only the card and the echo of a choice I was not prepared to make. I stared at it for a long moment, the noise of the bar rushing back in, my friend asking me what that was about, but her voice sounded far away, because all I could see was the clock in my mind counting down, each second bringing me closer to a deadline I could not meet alone. And before I could stop myself, before logic could catch up with desperation, my fingers closed around the card, my thumb tracing the embossed edge, and I realized with a quiet, sinking certainty that whatever happened next would not just solve my problem, it would change everything I thought I controlled about my life. I should not have called, that was my first clear thought as I stepped out into the cool night air, the noise of the bar fading behind me while the city stretched out in front of me, all glowing windows and distant traffic, like nothing in my world had shifted even though everything had. The card felt heavier in my hand than it should have, a simple piece of paper carrying a decision I could not undo once I made it, and I checked the time on my phone, 52 minutes left, 8 hours until the deadline that had been haunting me since morning, and suddenly the math felt brutal because even if this was a mistake, it was the only option that had shown up. I walked a few steps, then stopped, then walked again, my heels tapping against the sidewalk in uneven rhythm, my thoughts moving faster than my body because what kind of person agrees to something like this? What kind of situation pushes someone to even consider it? And the answer came back immediately, the kind that does not leave room for denial, someone who has no other choice. I thought about my sister, about the way she looked at me that morning, trying to be brave even though she was scared, trusting me to fix something that was already slipping out of my hands, and that was when I stopped pretending this was about pride or caution or common sense because none of those things mattered. If I failed her, I exhaled slowly, steadying my hands as I unlocked my phone, staring at the number on the card, memorizing it without meaning to, like it was already becoming part of my story whether I wanted it or not, and for a second, just 1 second, I hesitated, because calling meant stepping into something I did not understand, something I could not control, and walking away meant accepting that I would lose before I even tried. It is just a call, I whispered to myself, even though I knew it was not just a call, it was a decision dressed up as something smaller, something easier to justify, and before I could overthink it any further, I pressed dial. The line rang once, twice, and then it connected, no background noise, no delay, just a quiet, immediate presence on the other end. Like whoever was waiting had been expecting this moment down to the second. You are within the hour, his voice said, calm, certain, the same voice from the bar, and something in my chest tightened at how unsurprised he sounded, like there had never been any doubt that I would call. I have questions, I said quickly, trying to regain some ground, because if I was going to do this, I needed to understand what I was stepping into. But there was a brief pause, not dismissive, not impatient, just measured, like he was deciding how much to give me. You will have answers, he replied, but not over the phone, and I closed my eyes for a second, pressing my fingers against my temple. Because of course it was not going to be that simple, nothing about this felt simple, not from the moment he spoke to me. Then where? I asked, forcing my voice to stay steady because backing out now would be easier, safer, but also final, and I was not ready to accept that kind of final. He gave me an address, clear and precise, a location I recognized instantly, not because I had been there, but because everyone knew it, one of those places you only saw from the outside, guarded by reputation alone, the kind of building that did not advertise what happened inside because it did not need to. Be there in 20 minutes. He added, and before I could respond, the line went quiet, the call ending. With the same clean certainty it had begun. I lowered my phone slowly, staring at the dark screen, my reflection faint against the glass, and for the first time since this started, I felt something sharper than panic, something closer to realization, because this was no longer an idea, no longer a desperate statement thrown into a crowded room. This was real, structured, moving forward whether I was ready or not, and as I looked up at the city lights stretching endlessly ahead, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. I was not just running out of time, I was running into something that had already been set in motion long before I ever said those words. The building looked exactly like I imagined and nothing like I expected at the same time, rising 20 stories into the night sky with glass so dark it reflected the city instead of revealing anything inside. And as I stood across the street staring up at it, I felt smaller than I had all day, like I had just stepped into a place where people like me did not belong unless they were invited, and even then, only under certain conditions. I checked the time again, 19 minutes since the call, 1 minute early, and somehow that felt important, like being late was not an option here, like time meant something different to him, more precise, more controlled, and I smoothed my jacket without thinking, suddenly aware of how ordinary I looked, how out of place I would seem walking into a place like this with nothing but a desperate plan and a borrowed sense of courage. The entrance doors opened before I could reach for them, not dramatically, just enough to make it clear that someone inside already knew I was here, and that realization sent a quiet chill down my spine, not fear exactly but awareness, the kind that makes you realize you are being observed in ways you cannot see. Inside, the air was cooler, cleaner, the kind of silence that comes from expensive spaces where noise feels inappropriate, and the marble floors reflected the soft lighting above, every detail polished to perfection, every movement of mine suddenly louder in contrast. My footsteps echoing just enough to remind me that I was the only one making them. "Emily Carter," a voice said, and I turned to see a man standing near the reception desk, dressed in a dark suit that matched the tone of the entire place, his posture straight, his expression neutral but attentive, like he had been waiting specifically for me, which he probably had. "This way," he added, without asking for confirmation, and I hesitated for half a second before following because at this point, turning back would not undo anything. It would only leave everything unfinished. The elevator ride was silent, smooth, the kind that moves so perfectly you barely feel it, and I watched the numbers climb one by one, each floor bringing me closer to something I still did not fully understand, my reflection faint in the mirrored walls, my expression tighter than I wanted it to be. When the doors opened, the space beyond was quieter still, a private floor, no reception, no visible staff. Just a long hallway with soft lighting and closed doors that gave nothing away. And the man guiding me stopped at the end, stepping aside as if crossing some invisible line was mine to do alone. I took a breath, steadying myself, then reached for the door handle, my fingers brushing against cool metal, and for a brief moment everything slowed because I knew that once I walked in, whatever control I thought I had left would shift, maybe disappear entirely. I pushed the door open. He was already there, standing near the window, the city lights stretching behind him like a backdrop that belonged to him more than anyone else, his silhouette sharp against the glass, and when he turned, his gaze found mine instantly, like it had been waiting for this exact second. "You came," he said, not surprised, not impressed, just confirming something that had already been decided, and I stepped inside, the door closing quietly behind me, sealing the space in a way that felt deliberate, final. "I need to understand what you are offering," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, because if I was going to do this, I needed more than vague promises and controlled silence. He studied me for a moment, then moved toward the desk, where a set of papers rested in perfect alignment, untouched until now, and as he placed his hand lightly on top of them, his expression did not change, but the weight of the moment did. "A solution," he said simply, sliding the documents a few inches closer to me, "with terms," and I looked down at the papers, my name already printed on the first page, clean and precise, as if this had been prepared before I ever picked up the phone, before I ever walked into that bar, and a quiet realization settled in my chest, heavier than anything before. This was not something that started tonight. This was something I had just stepped into at the exact moment it was meant to begin. My name printed on a document I had never seen before should have been enough to make me walk away, but instead I stood there staring at it, my fingers hovering just above the page without touching it, like the paper itself might burn if I made contact, because this was no longer a vague offer or a strange conversation in a crowded bar. This was structured, intentional, prepared in advance, and that realization settled deep in my chest, heavier than fear, heavier than doubt. You prepared this already, I said slowly, lifting my eyes to meet his, searching for something in his expression that would explain why, but Adrian Volkov did not look like a man who explained things he did not need to explain. He just watched me with that same calm focus, like every reaction I had was expected, accounted for. I prepare for possibilities, he replied, his voice even, controlled, and I let out a quiet breath, shaking my head slightly because that was not a normal answer. That was the kind of answer that came from someone who did not leave outcomes to chance. Someone who decided them ahead of time. I looked back down at the document, forcing myself to read, each line clean, precise, written in language that left very little room for interpretation. A legal agreement, not symbolic, not temporary in the way I had tried to convince myself earlier. This was real, binding, recognized, and my pulse quickened as the meaning settled in, because this was not just about helping me meet a deadline. This was about becoming part of something far larger than I had intended. This is not what I meant, I said, my voice quieter now, less certain, because somewhere along the way, the situation had shifted from something I could control to something that was already moving forward without waiting for me to catch up. You asked for a husband, he said, stepping closer, not invading my space, but close enough that I could feel the difference in the air again, that quiet pressure of presence that made everything else feel less important. This is the most efficient way to meet your requirement. And there it was again, that word requirement, like this was a problem to be solved, not a life to be changed. Why me? I asked before I could stop myself, because that question had been building since the moment he approached me, growing louder with every step I took toward this room, and for the first time there was a pause, not long but noticeable, like he was deciding how much truth to give me. Because you asked, he said finally, and it was such a simple answer that it almost felt like a deflection, but something in his gaze told me there was more beneath it, something he was not saying yet. I let out a slow breath, pressing my fingertips lightly against the edge of the desk, grounding myself in something physical, something real, because everything else felt like it was shifting too quickly, like I was being pulled into a current I did not understand. And if I say no? I asked, lifting my head again, forcing myself to hold his gaze because I needed to know if this was truly a choice or just the illusion of one. His expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, a stillness that felt deliberate. Then you walk away, he said, simply, no threat, no persuasion, just a statement, and somehow that made it more complicated, because it meant the decision was entirely mine, which meant the consequences would be too. I looked back down at the papers one more time, my name staring back at me like it was already part of something I had not agreed to yet, my mind racing through every possible outcome, every risk, every unknown, but none of them as immediate or as certain as the deadline waiting for me outside this room. My hand moved before my thoughts fully caught up, fingers brushing the edge of the document, pulling it slightly closer, and in that small, almost unconscious movement, I felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, like I had just crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and somewhere in the silence between us, I realized that this was no longer about whether I trusted him, it was about whether I was willing to risk everything on a decision I did not fully understand, because time was no longer something I could afford to waste. The paper felt heavier the moment I pulled it closer, like the decision was already settling into my hands before I had fully made it, and I forced myself to keep reading, every line sharp, deliberate, leaving no space for misunderstanding, no hidden clauses disguised in complicated language, just clarity that made it harder to ignore what this really was. Legal names, dates, conditions, all aligned with precision, and at the center of it all, one undeniable fact. This was a real marriage, not a temporary arrangement, not something that quietly expired when my problem was solved. This was permanent in the way that documents like this are designed to be. This does not end after tomorrow, I said, my voice quieter now, more controlled, because saying it out loud made it real in a way reading it had not, and I lifted my eyes to him again, searching for hesitation, for negotiation, for anything that suggested flexibility. No, Adrian said, simply, no pause, no softening, just certainty. And the finality of that word echoed louder than anything else in the room. I swallowed, my fingers tightening slightly against the edge of the paper. Because this was the part that mattered, not the convenience, not the solution, but the cost, the part that would stay long after the urgency had passed. Then why would anyone agree to this? I asked, not expecting a comforting answer, but needing something that made sense beyond desperation. He studied me for a moment, his gaze steady, measuring, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted just enough to feel intentional. Because the alternative is worse, he said, and something in the way he said it told me he was not guessing, he knew. He had already calculated the outcome of every path I could take, including the one where I walked away. My mind immediately went back to the deadline, to the consequences waiting for me if I failed, the kind that did not leave room for recovery, the kind that would follow me long after tomorrow passed, and I closed my eyes for a brief second, pressing back against the weight of it all. You do not even know the full situation, I said, but even as I said it, I realized how weak that sounded because he did not need to know everything, he only needed to know enough and somehow he already did. I know enough to offer a solution, he replied, and again there was no arrogance in it, just quiet certainty, like he had already decided this outcome before I ever stepped into the room. I exhaled slowly, opening my eyes and looking back down at the document, my name still there, waiting unchanged, as if it had always belonged on that page. And for the first time since this began, the panic inside me shifted into something else, something steadier, not calm but focused, because this was no longer about whether I liked the situation, it was about whether I could accept it. If I sign this, I said carefully, each word deliberate, what happens next? And that question felt different from the others, less about fear, more about understanding the path I was about to step onto. Adrian moved then, not quickly, not dramatically, just enough to close the distance between us, his presence filling the space in a way that made everything else fade slightly into the background. Everything changes, he said, his voice lower now, more direct, and there was something in it that made my breath catch, not because it was threatening, but because it was absolute, leaving no room for interpretation. I held his gaze for a second longer, searching for anything that suggested doubt, but there was none, only certainty, and that certainty was the most dangerous part of all, because it made my own hesitation feel small, temporary, something that would disappear the moment I made a decision. My hand moved again, this time not just touching the paper, but reaching for the pen placed beside it, my fingers wrapping around it slowly, the weight of it grounding, real, undeniable, and as I hovered just above the signature line, I realized something I had not allowed myself to admit before. This was never just about solving a problem, it was about stepping into a life I did not recognize, one that had been waiting just beyond my reach, and the moment the pen touched the paper, even before the ink fully formed my name, I knew there would be no version of me that could go back to who I was before tonight. The sound of the pen against paper was softer than I expected, almost insignificant, a faint scratch that should not have meant anything, but it did, it meant everything, and as the ink settled into my name, forming letters I had written 1,000 times before, it felt different this time, heavier, like each stroke carried a consequence I could not yet fully see. I finished signing and for a second I just stared at it, my own signature looking unfamiliar on a document like this, like it belonged to someone else, someone who made decisions without hesitation, someone who did not stand at the edge of something irreversible and wonder if they should run instead. I placed the pen down slowly, the small click echoing louder than it should have in the quiet room, and when I lifted my head, Adrian was already watching me, not with surprise, not with satisfaction, just with that same steady awareness, like this outcome had been inevitable from the beginning. It is done, he said, his voice calm, final, and something in my chest tightened at the simplicity of it, because nothing about what I had just done felt simple. I let out a slow breath, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk as I tried to process the shift, the invisible line I had just crossed, because there was no immediate change, no dramatic moment, no sudden difference in the air, and yet everything felt altered in a way I could not undo. What happens now? I asked, my voice quieter, not from fear, but from the weight of the moment settling in, and Adrian moved then, reaching for the document, his fingers brushing the page briefly, before he straightened it with precise care, like even the smallest details mattered. Now we make it official, he said, and I blinked, the words taking a second to register, because in my mind, this had already been official the moment I signed, but clearly in his world, there were layers to this, steps that needed to be completed in a way that left no room for doubt. Tonight, he added, and that one word landed with more force than anything else he had said, because it erased any illusion that I had time to adjust, time to think, time to prepare for what came next. Tonight, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper, and for the first time since I walked into this building, something close to disbelief slipped through my composure, because this was moving faster than I could keep up with, faster than I could fully understand. You had a deadline, he said, meeting my gaze directly, and there it was again, that reminder, sharp and undeniable, the reason I had stepped into this. In the first place, the reason I could not afford to hesitate now. I nodded slowly, more to myself than to him, because he was right, this was what I had asked for, just not in the way I had imagined, not with this level of precision, this level of permanence. You will be prepared, he continued, his tone steady, controlled like everything else about him. Everything necessary has already been arranged, and that word again, arranged, like my life had been moved into place without me noticing. Like the path I was on had been set long before I realized I was walking it. I straightened slightly, pulling my shoulders back, trying to hold on to some sense of control, even if it was just in how I stood, how I faced what was coming. And if I changed my mind? I asked, even though part of me already knew the answer, needed to hear it anyway, needed to understand the boundaries of the choice I had made. Adrian did not answer immediately, and in that brief silence the room felt still, expectant, like it was waiting with me. Then he spoke, his voice quieter this time but no less certain. You will not, he said, not as a command, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, and something about the way he said it made my breath catch, because it was not confidence, it was certainty, the kind that comes from knowing more than you are saying. I held his gaze for a moment longer, searching for doubt, for anything that suggested this was not as final as it felt, but there was nothing, just that same unwavering presence. And as the silence stretched between us, I realized something that settled deep in my chest, heavier than fear, heavier than regret. This was no longer about whether I could walk away, it was about understanding that I already had not. The word tonight stayed in my head long after he said it, repeating in a quiet loop as if my mind was trying to catch up to a reality that refused to slow down for me. And I found myself nodding without fully realizing it, as though agreeing was the only way to keep moving forward without falling apart. Adrian turned slightly, a small gesture, but it shifted the entire energy of the room, like a signal had been given that I could not see, and almost immediately, the door behind me opened with soft precision, the same man from earlier stepping in without hesitation, his presence calm, efficient, as if this moment had been scheduled down to the second. Everything is ready, he said, his voice respectful but neutral, and I felt my stomach tighten at the confirmation, because hearing it out loud made it real in a way nothing else had. There was no delay, no pause, no space to reconsider. Everything had already been set in motion. You will go with him, Adrian said, his gaze returning to me, steady as ever, and I hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not because I planned to refuse but because I was trying to hold on to some part of myself that still felt like it belonged to the life I had before tonight. I nodded, the movement small but final, and turned toward the door, my steps measured, controlled, even though my thoughts were anything but racing ahead, trying to predict what came next and failing every time. The hallway felt quieter now, almost expectant, like the building itself was aware of the change that had just taken place. And the man guiding me did not speak, did not explain, just led me down the corridor with the same steady pace, as if conversation was unnecessary because everything had already been decided. We stopped in front of another door, one I had not noticed before, and when it opened the difference was immediate, softer lighting, warmer tones, a space that felt less like an office and more like somewhere meant for transformation, and for a moment I stood at the threshold, taking it in, because this was where the abstract idea of what I had agreed to began to take physical form. You have 1 hour, the man said, stepping aside, and I glanced at him, the number settling into my mind with quiet intensity. 1 hour to become something I had not planned to be. 1 hour to step fully into a role I had barely understood when I signed that paper. I stepped inside, the door closing gently behind me, and for a second I just stood there, my reflection catching in a large mirror across the room. The same face, the same features, but something in my expression had shifted, something more serious, more aware, like I had crossed into a version of myself that could not pretend this was temporary anymore. The room was prepared, carefully arranged, everything in its place, as if someone had anticipated exactly what would be needed, and I walked slowly toward the mirror, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table beside it, grounding myself in something tangible. I thought about the bar, the noise, the careless way I had said those words, how impossible everything had felt in that moment, and how quickly impossible had turned into inevitable. And as I met my own gaze in the reflection, I realized something that settled deep in my chest, steady and undeniable. This was no longer about surviving a deadline. It was about stepping into a life that had already begun shaping itself around me. And whether I was ready or not no longer mattered, because somewhere between that crowded bar and this silent room, I had stopped being the one in control of what happened next. Time does not slow down when your life changes, it speeds up, it compresses every second into something sharper, more urgent. And as I stood in that room with 1 hour quietly counting down, I could feel it slipping through my fingers faster than I could process what I was becoming. I moved toward the wardrobe set against the far wall, the doors already slightly open as if inviting me to step closer, and when I did, I realized nothing inside was random. Every piece carefully selected, tailored, aligned with a version of me that did not exist an hour ago, and yet was expected to exist now. My fingers brushed against the fabric of a dress hanging at the center, smooth, structured, the kind of design that did not ask for attention but commanded it anyway, and I hesitated for a brief moment, because wearing it would mean accepting the role it represented, stepping fully into something I had only agreed to on paper. I exhaled slowly, grounding myself in the simple act of breathing because hesitation was no longer a luxury I could afford, not with everything already in motion, and I took the dress from its place, the weight of it settling into my hands with quiet certainty. The room remained silent as I changed, no interruptions, no voices, just the soft sounds of movement and fabric, and for a moment, I focused only on that, on the physical reality of what I was doing, because it was easier than thinking about the meaning behind it. When I stepped back in front of the mirror, I stopped, not out of vanity but out of recognition, because the reflection staring back at me looked different, not in features, not in anything obvious, but in presence, in the way I held myself, the way my shoulders were set, the way my eyes seemed more aware, more focused, like I had crossed into a version of myself that did not hesitate as easily. I lifted my hand slightly, adjusting a small detail at my collar, watching the movement with quiet attention, and I realized something then, something subtle but undeniable. This transformation was not being forced on me. I was stepping into it, piece by piece, decision by decision, even if those decisions had been made under pressure. There was a soft knock at the door, controlled, precise, and I turned toward it instinctively, my heartbeat steady but present, because this was the moment where preparation ended and reality began. Time, the voice from outside said, calm and measured, and I glanced once more at the mirror, taking in the image one last time, not to admire it, but to understand it, to accept that this was who I needed to be now. I moved toward the door, each step deliberate, the sound of my heels against the floor more confident than before, and when I opened it, the man from earlier was waiting. His expression unchanged, as if this was exactly what he expected to see. He nodded once, a small acknowledgement, then stepped aside to lead the way again, and I followed without hesitation this time, because there was no longer a question of whether I would continue, only how I would carry myself as I did. The hallway felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I had, and as we walked, I could feel the shift in my own awareness, sharper, more focused, like I was seeing everything more clearly than before. When we reached the elevator, the doors opened immediately, and I stepped inside, my reflection catching in the mirrored walls once more. But this time, I did not look away. I held my own gaze, steady and unwavering, because somewhere between that first desperate sentence and this silent ride downward, I had stopped reacting to what was happening and started becoming part of it. And as the doors closed and the elevator began to move, I realized with quiet certainty that whatever waited at the end of this descent was not just a continuation of what I had agreed to. It was the moment everything would become undeniable, not just on paper, but in the world beyond this building, where there would be no turning back and no version of my life that did not include him. The elevator slowed with a precision that felt intentional, not mechanical, like even its movement was controlled by the same unseen force that had guided every step of this night. And when the doors opened, the world on the other side was different from anything I had walked through before, not louder, not more extravagant, but sharper, more aware, like every detail had purpose. The space we stepped into was filled with quiet conversation and low lighting, a private gathering rather than a public event, people dressed in tailored suits and elegant gowns, their voices controlled, their movements deliberate, and as I crossed the threshold, I felt it immediately, the shift in attention, subtle but unmistakable, eyes turning, not openly staring but noticing, assessing, like my presence had already been anticipated. I kept my posture steady, my steps even, reminding myself of the reflection I had just left behind. The version of me that did not hesitate, that understood this was no longer about blending in but about stepping into something defined. The man guiding me moved slightly ahead, clearing a path without drawing attention, and I followed, aware of the way the room seemed to part just enough, not out of politeness but out of recognition, as if the space itself adjusted to certain people without needing explanation. And then I saw him. Adrian stood near the center of the room, not elevated, not surrounded in an obvious way, but everything around him seemed to orient in his direction, conversation subtly shifting, movements aligning, like he was the fixed point everything else revolved around, and as I approached, his gaze lifted, finding mine immediately, steady and unwavering, like he had been tracking my presence long before I stepped into view. I slowed slightly, not out of doubt, but to match the rhythm of the space, the unspoken expectation of control, and when I reached him, the distance between us closed in a way that felt deliberate, like a line had been drawn and I had just stepped across it. "You are on time," he said, his voice low, measured, and I nodded once, the simplicity of the exchange grounding in a way I did not expect, because it felt less like an introduction and more like a confirmation. His gaze moved over me briefly, not lingering, not intrusive, just enough to take in the details, and there was a subtle shift in his expression, not a smile, not approval, but something that suggested alignment, like I had met an expectation I did not fully understand. "Stay close," he added, and the words were quiet, almost casual, but there was something in them that carried weight. Not a request, not even a command, but an understanding of how things worked here, and without thinking I nodded again, stepping into position beside him. The room continued around us, conversations resuming, movement flowing, but the difference now was clear. I was no longer observing from the outside, I was part of it, positioned at the center of something structured, something intentional, and as Adrian shifted slightly, his presence aligning with mine in a way that felt both protective and defining, I became aware of how people reacted, how their attention adjusted, how their posture subtly changed, like my place beside him had already assigned me a role I had not yet learned to play. "It will be formal," he said after a moment, his voice just low enough that only I could hear, and I turned my head slightly, catching the edge of his words, "but brief," and I exhaled slowly, absorbing that, because formal meant witnesses, meant recognition, meant something that could not be undone quietly. I glanced around once more, taking in the space, the people, the quiet precision of it all, and I realized that this was not just a setting, it was a statement, a controlled environment where nothing happened by accident, where every detail served a purpose. And as I stood there beside him, aware of every glance, every subtle shift in the room, I understood something with a clarity that settled deep and steady. This was not just about becoming his wife on paper. This was about being seen as such in a world that did not question his decisions, and once that recognition happened, once it became real in the eyes of everyone here, there would be no version of this that remained temporary, no quiet way to step back into the life I had before, because this moment, this place, this choice was designed to make everything permanent. The room did not need an announcement to shift, it happened in small ways first, a pause in conversation here, a glance held a second longer there, like a ripple moving through still water, and then it settled into something quieter, more focused, as if everyone present understood without being told that the next moment mattered. I felt it in the way the air seemed to tighten, in the way my own breath slowed slightly, not from fear, but from awareness, because whatever was about to happen was not just a formality, it was a declaration. Adrian moved first, not dramatically, just a subtle step forward, and that was enough, the room adjusting around him, attention aligning without resistance, and I followed half a step behind before instinct shifted me to his side again, matching his pace, matching the quiet certainty in his movement even if I was still learning it. A man stood ahead of us, older, composed, holding a thin folder in his hands, his posture straight, his expression neutral but attentive, and I realized immediately what his role was, not because anyone had explained it, but because everything about this moment pointed to it. This was where words would be spoken that carried weight beyond the room. "We will proceed," the man said, his voice calm, measured, carrying just enough to reach those closest without breaking the controlled atmosphere. And I felt my heartbeat steady, not racing, not slowing, just present, like it had found a rhythm that matched everything around me. I kept my gaze forward, aware of Adrian beside me, of the subtle way his presence anchored the space, and when the man began to speak, outlining terms that sounded familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, I realized how carefully this had been constructed, every word chosen, every step intentional, nothing left to chance. I listened not to memorize but to understand, to let the reality of what I had agreed to settle into something solid, something I could stand on, without questioning every second, because hesitation here would not change anything, it would only make me appear unprepared, and that was one thing I refused to be. "Do you accept?" the man asked, his gaze shifting briefly toward me, not challenging, not pressuring, just waiting, and for a fraction of a second time seemed to narrow, not stop, just focus, like everything else faded slightly into the background, leaving only that question and the answer I already knew. I glanced at Adrian, not for permission, not for reassurance, but for alignment, and he met my gaze instantly, steady, unwavering. Like he had already accounted for this moment, like my answer was something he had expected long before it was spoken. "Yes," I said, my voice clear, stronger than I expected, and the word felt different once it left my lips, not just a response but a confirmation, something that could not be taken back or rephrased. The man nodded once, acknowledging it without ceremony, and continued, his attention shifting now to Adrian, repeating the same question, the same weight, and when Adrian answered, his voice was just as steady, just as certain. There was no hesitation, no pause, just agreement delivered with the same controlled precision he had shown from the beginning. Something shifted then, not in the room but in me, a quiet realization settling deeper than anything before, because this was no longer a decision waiting to be made. It was a decision that had just been witnessed, recognized, set into place in a way that extended beyond this moment. The man closed the folder with a soft, deliberate motion, signaling the end of something and the beginning of something else, and as the quiet murmur of the room slowly returned, I became aware of the subtle changes around us, the way people looked at me now, not with curiosity, but with acknowledgement, like my place beside Adrian had just been confirmed in a language everyone here understood without needing explanation. I exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of acceptance, because there was no longer anything to process, no uncertainty to resolve, only a new reality that had just taken shape around me, solid and undeniable. And as I stood there beside him, feeling the weight of every glance, every unspoken recognition, I understood with absolute clarity that this moment had done exactly what it was meant to do. It had turned something private into something visible, something temporary into something permanent, and there was no part of my life that would remain untouched by it. The shift after the words were spoken was subtle but undeniable, like the room had quietly rewritten its understanding of me without needing to say it out loud, and as conversations resumed around us, I could feel it in the way people approached, not directly, not intrusively, but with a measured awareness, like every glance now carried recognition instead of curiosity. I stood beside Adrian, aware of the steady presence he maintained, the way nothing about him had changed even though everything about my position had, and for a moment I focused on that contrast, how easily he occupied this world while I was still adjusting to the weight of it. "You did well," he said quietly, just enough for me to hear, and I turned my head slightly, catching the calm certainty in his tone, not praise, not reassurance, just acknowledgement, like I had met a standard that mattered here. I nodded once, not trusting myself to say more, because the realization of what had just happened was still settling into something I could fully understand, something that extended beyond this room and into every part of my life waiting outside. One by one, people began to approach, their greetings polite, controlled, their words carefully chosen, and I noticed the pattern almost immediately. They spoke to him first, always him, but their attention included me, their acknowledgement subtle but intentional, like my presence beside him had already been accepted as fact, not questioned, not challenged. I responded the best I could, measured, aware, matching the tone of the room because anything less would stand out in a way I could not afford. And with each interaction, I felt the shift continue, small but steady, like I was being placed into a role through repetition rather than instruction. Time moved differently here, not slower, not faster, just more deliberate, each moment carrying weight, each exchange serving a purpose. And I stayed close to Adrian as he had said, not out of obligation, but because I understood now that proximity meant something in this space. It defined perception, it shaped reality. After a while, the movement of the room began to thin slightly, conversations breaking into smaller groups, attention dispersing, and Adrian turned just enough to face me more directly, his expression unchanged but his focus sharper, like the external part of the evening had ended and something more private was beginning. "We will leave soon," he said, and I nodded, the simplicity of his words grounding in a way I had not expected, because leaving implied continuation, implied that this was not an isolated moment but part of something ongoing. I glanced around the room one more time, taking in the details I had missed before, the structure, the control, the quiet understanding that governed everything here, and I realized how quickly it had become familiar. Not comfortable, not yet, but recognizable like a language. I had just begun to understand. "There are things you will need to know," he continued, his voice steady, and I met his gaze again, more prepared this time, more aware of what it meant to stand here, to listen, to accept what came next without hesitation. I nodded once more, the movement firm, intentional, because whatever came after this, whatever adjustments I would need to make, whatever truths I had yet to uncover, they were no longer optional. They were part of the life I had stepped into. As we moved toward the exit, the space behind us continuing without pause, I felt the shift settle fully into place, not sudden, not overwhelming, but complete in its own quiet way, like something had locked into position inside me, aligning with the reality around me. And as the doors opened and the night air met us again, I understood with a clarity that did not need to be explained. This was not the end of a desperate decision. It was the beginning of something structured, intentional, and far more permanent than I had ever planned for, something that would not unfold all at once, but piece by piece, moment by moment, until there was no part of me left that still belonged to the life I had before. The night air felt different when I stepped outside again, not colder, not quieter, just sharper, like every sensation had been turned up slightly, and I realized it was not the world that had changed, it was me, the way I noticed things, the way I stood, the way I understood what had just happened and what it meant moving forward. The city stretched out in front of us, lights glowing in steady patterns, traffic moving with familiar rhythm, everything continuing as if nothing had shifted, and yet I knew with absolute certainty that nothing in my life would move the same way again. Adrian walked beside me, his pace unhurried, controlled, as if time adjusted itself to him rather than the other way around, and without thinking I matched it, my steps aligning with his in a way that felt less like following and more like understanding an unspoken rule. The car waiting at the curb did not draw attention, not in the way I would have expected. It was understated, precise, like everything else connected to him, and as the door opened I paused for a fraction of a second, not from hesitation but from awareness, because stepping inside meant continuing forward without pause, without the illusion of stepping back. I entered the interior quiet, controlled, the outside world dimming as the door closed, and for a moment I allowed myself to breathe, to feel the weight of everything settle into something steady instead of overwhelming. Adrian took his place beside me, the space shifting again, not physically but in presence, like the air itself adjusted to him, and as the car began to move, the city lights sliding past the window in smooth, uninterrupted lines, I realized this was the first moment all night where there was nothing to perform, nothing to respond to, just space to understand. "Your deadline is resolved," he said after a moment, his voice calm, direct, and I turned slightly toward him, the words landing with a quiet impact, because they were the reason this had all begun. The urgency that had pushed me into a decision I had not planned to make. I nodded slowly, absorbing that, feeling the tension that had been sitting in my chest all day finally loosened just enough to be noticed, not gone but changed, replaced by something deeper, something more permanent. "And everything else," he continued, his gaze steady as it met mine, "will follow structure." And I held his gaze, recognizing the meaning behind his words. This was not just reassurance. It was a statement of how my life would function now, defined, organized, shaped by rules I had not yet learned. "I understand," I said, and for the first time, I meant it in a way that went beyond surface-level agreement, because understanding here was not about knowing every detail, it was about accepting the framework, the direction, the reality of what I had stepped into. Silence settled between us again, but it was different now, not uncertain, not heavy, just present, like it belonged. And as I looked out the window, watching the city continue its endless motion, I realized something that felt both grounding and unsettling at the same time. The life I had before was still out there. Still moving, still existing exactly as it had this morning. But I was no longer part of it in the same way. I turned my gaze back forward, my reflection faint against the glass, the version of me from earlier barely recognizable in the way I carried myself now. And I let that realization settle fully, without resisting it, without trying to hold on to what had already shifted. Adrian did not speak again, and he did not need to because everything that mattered had already been said, not just in words but in actions, in decisions, in the quiet certainty that had guided every step of this night. And as the car moved steadily through the city, carrying me further away from the life I had known and deeper into the one I had just chosen, I understood something with a clarity that did not need explanation. I had asked for a solution, something temporary, something simple, but what I had been given was not an answer. It was a direction, one that would not end when my problem was solved, one that would continue unfolding long after tonight, because some choices do not just fix what is broken, they redefine who you are allowed to become.